Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the complete delight of speaking with Cleo today, who I always look forward to speaking with. Her scholarship is top-notch. Her thinking, her elegance are just always a delight to have the pleasure of being in the presence of, to learn from, and to enjoy. So I'm really thrilled to have a chance to speak with her today. Both her and I just came from we had the Rosy conference too at Philosophy Portal, which was truly tremendous. Cadell last hosted it. It had followed the course and was kind of a summation of the work on Christian atheism that he had been doing and that students had been gathering for. And I always look forward to the Philosophy Portal conferences. So we just thought we'd get together and talk about different things that came out of the conferences, ideas, what we're excited about. So Cleo, what are you thinking about in light of all that and in general?
A thousand things. I think the point of intersection we had was my presentation, for those who didn't hear it, focused in the beginning on the work of Jean-Luc Nancy, who is a French continental philosopher of the usual stripe. And a figure I hadn't paid much attention to, but he had just published two volumes 10 or so years ago, specifically on Christian atheism. So I was reviewing those and picking up things I had not heard before. But the point of intersection with your wonderful presentation, which is so full I could go in 1,000 directions, is this notion of enclosure and of what you call the AA enclosure, the closed circle, the closed loop of what we might call dogmatism, or of not so much dogmatism as a kind of affirmation of Christian faith as essentially the kit that has the answers, right? Uh, and wanting not to do that, and I wanted to bring forward Nancy's kind of attempt to speak about what he calls dis-enclosure, which is what he wants to see, but to speak about it in such a way as he's not sort of suggesting that there's some sort of transcendent way to jump out of the two systems that are engaging, but that they open to one another without necessarily implying more than that. I think it's a great model for one of your concerns that most interests me, Daniel, which I really think you're thinking through what it is going to be like to follow any particular path in a context of what old school would call pluralism, but which I think is better said to be the global economy of spirit, right? The and we know that we have those of us who work in the Christian tradition. This is the domain of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is famously outside of institutions. In fact, rather oppositional to institutions. So, um, the Spirit bloweth where it listeth, and no man knows the direction thereof. So I wanted to open up that question of the relationship between an enclosed system and a disenclosed system, and your articulation of the need somehow to keep both in play, if I understood you correctly. And I want to know, and I want us to chat a bit about what happens on that edge when those two things collide, right? What is that? Is that a dialectical moment? Is it a supplementary moment? I love Derrida's complement of the concept of the supplement. Is it oppositional? Does it get us in a binary, which we also don't want? I want to hear from you, Daniel, about what it's like to work on the edge of that.
Well, I think that is a tremendous topic, and I think it's a critical question. My first knee jerk is to almost talk about a certain skillfulness, because
Yes.
there is an issue too where if it's always dialectical, there's a certain closeness to the response, right? Like, and if the response is always, say, dialectical, or if it is always sub oppositional, or if it is always a certain sort of opposition, well,
Mhm.
then that in of itself is a certain kind of enclosure because you know what to do on the edge, right? So the
Uh,
edge has to bring with it a certain fluidity, or else the edge is almost just an appearance of the edge because it doesn't bring you to the edge, right? It might be the edge of the religion or the edge of the philosophy or whatever, but if it doesn't bring you to the edge, then you can't experience it. You're not going to feel it, and it's not going to
exactly.
be something that actually works on you as a subject, right? So there's something very interesting about the edge having to have a certain openness, even in the kind of response that is proper to it, while simultaneously it can't close off any of the options, right? Because if we say, well, it's not dialectical, well, it's not oppositional. Ah, good. Then there's a little bit of enclosure there, right?
Right, exactly. Good.
So there has to be a certain, well, this is what's very tricky. There has to be a certain discernment and skillfulness and an awareness of these very nuanced, fine differences. Like obviously in my presentation, and I'll be curious just your initial response to what I'm saying, because it's like this very fine distinction between appearing heretical and being heretical that I was talking about, right? So you're not to be heretical, you're to appear heretical. Well, what in the world? You know, that's very, very difficult. But that is the only way that you force the system. I just talk about in The Map is Indestructible, quote unquote, which is book 2 of The Truism of the Rational, internally consistent systems, which are systems that entail no internal contradiction and yet nevertheless may not correspond with reality. That is kind of, in my opinion, a truly deep realization of thought that obviously, as you know, I call the girdle point. It's where you realize that you can have something totally coherent with no internal contradictions, and yet it could still not correspond with reality. Well, what in the world is thought doing then? What in the world are we to do if consistency does not equal correspondence, right? Now, critically, Kurt Gödel is not saying that therefore truth doesn't exist. He's not saying that there couldn't be a God or anything. There's arguments to be made that he puts forth new ontological arguments, and he's big on Leibniz or different things. He's clearly a mathematical Platonist. So he's not talking about the impossibility of some sort of greater truth, however you want to language that. But he's saying that coherence doesn't equal correspondence.
Yes.
So but thought is in the business of coherence. And you require thought because if you had correspondence but not coherence, it'd be meaningless to you. You couldn't live it. You couldn't enact it, right? So you need coherence to make correspondence meaningful, which isn't correspondence. Well, my goodness, how are we? And then what that ultimately means for me is that the person, the subject themselves, has to stand in the girdle point. You have to be in that point and live and dwell in it to precisely skillfully operate these two tensions that are always in opposition with one another. Coherence is always trying to overcome correspondence, and correspondence is always trying to say it doesn't need coherence and leave it behind, right? And that kind of, dare I say, spiritual warfare, and I really do think you can think about coherence versus correspondence as a kind of spiritual warfare that is going on. But the answer in spiritual warfare is never destroying entirely. It is about a certain ordering, a certain bringing it back into the right way so that all things can be new and all things can be redeemed. But order, the problem is too, when we hear the word order, we often hear stagnancy. But order is a very skillful thing. You have to put it in order. It's not given by the structure. So this is the other issue we're talking about. We're talking about order set by a subject, not order given by a structure. And that's where I'm starting, you know, because on this question of how I think enclosure and declosure, like dis-enclosure together, it's something about the subject setting the order versus the subject, the structure setting the order. But here's the problem. The structure is always trying to make the subject think it is doing the ordering, that it isn't outsourced its discernment to the structure, and then causing an amnesia to make you not realize you're not doing that, right? Which, you know,
see. Let me note that that's where your emphasis on memory comes. Okay, good. Go on. I'm just noting.
No, that's exactly right. Because the great, like, we've all had the moment, like I had it earlier today, where you truly cannot remember where you put your car keys. Yes. And when you really have that experience, there's something very frightening about it, actually. Like, really disturbing, because you're like, I just had them, and for the life of me, I cannot remember where they are. Like this feeling of you being, how can I do this to myself where I can just truly forget something? Or like it just left me, right? That capacity of the subject is actually always at play in this problem. Like you literally will have you'll have a remembering of the girdle point, a remembering of this spiritual warfare, and then 2 days later you just naturally find yourself forgetting things, right? And for me, a bit of the terror, like when we talk about, like you noted very well, the question of kind of the terror of the living God versus what's more terrifying, the dead God or the living God, right? I think that's a very important idea. There's something about the terror of the subject to ourselves being this capacity to forget things. Like, and that's why God's always like, remember the Lord God that got you out of Egypt. Remember. Plato and Meno is like, hey, memory. Augustine is basically suggesting memory is the place where God is found, mixed with imagination and the later of the Confessions. Like, there's something about part of the dire work of, and then I'll give it to you on any comments on absolutely anything. These are just opening thoughts. Part of the dire work of dwelling in the girdle point, which for me is necessary, and then learning the skillfulness to work the girdle point, which then gets into all this stuff also at the end of the presentation on, avoiding coronization, social coordination mechanism, and being willing to be seen with sinners, quote unquote. Dwelling in the girdle point is so difficult because you just kind of naturally forget to do it. You then just kind of wander out of it one day. And then you're like, oh, wait, why did I do that? Like forgetting your car keys. And that act of memory is one of the most important activities to stay in the space where enclosure and disenclosure, correspondence and coherence do not overwhelm one another. Is this profound act of memory is at the heart of the spiritual battle, beatific vision, subjectivity, virtue. I would even put it at the heart of virtue, which I just kind of associate with that wild feeling of not remembering where you put your keys when you just had them 5 minutes ago. We actually do that all the time on bigger time scales, so it's not as pronounced to us, but it's the same sort of activity. So much of it is tied to memory. But let me give it to you.
Oh, so good. You're reminding me of our beloved Simone Weil, who used to tell her students, look, if you can get through the entire Lord's Prayer without your mind wandering one time, you're an advanced practitioner, And everybody goes, oh, piece of cake, and then they try it, and that forgetting is just, yeah, that's really great. I want to try to tie that in my mind to your concept of heresy, to the way you're presenting heresy. And I totally take on board your distinction between appearing heretic and being heretic, and I get that piece. It's to me it's an odd word, and I've thought a lot about heresy in my life, having been a natural heretic in every construct I've ever inhabited. I have been the heretic. So I just laugh. That's the laughter of old age, where you can't even express the exquisite level of the irony of your life, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Words fail you. But anyway, I was thinking about heresy because, a lot of my thinking and my mind is colored by two things. The concept, I've done a lot of work on the concept of sacrifice, and that's a whole dimension of what my thinking is. But also I've pondered a lot because my study of sacrifices involved trying to figure out the different concepts and constructs of sacrifice in the three Abrahamic religions. Okay, and it's a wonderful way into the interface of that Borromean knot, as I like to call it, between those three. And each one of those religions is heretical vis-a-vis the others. So, and in fact, it's heretical from its foundation, and it's heretical by intention. I strayed into heresy because I'm following who knows what weird impulse, right? But these were intentional heresies, right? And they're more than an internal dissent. They're not a difference of opinion or a difference about a dogma. But the heresy is only heretical from the point of the view of one of the other two. When they're pulled apart, they become totally closed systems, each one. Together, heresy makes them into a system of disenclosure, right? But there is, the most dramatic example for me is Islam. I think I ponder Islam. So I was so happy our comrade Dominic brought Islam in a beautiful way at that conference. I think about Islam a lot because I always like to think about the most challenging form of opposition that you can get. In fact, I am occasional lay preacher at the little congregational church near me. They don't seem to mind that I'm both a shaman and a Catholic. They're like, any port in a storm, Cleo. So they asked me to give a series of lectures on the Abrahamic religions. And at the end of it, one of my dear, dear conventional old New England lady parishioners came up to me and she said, Cleo, I really think I'm a Muslim. I had done such a good job of inhabiting each of these, right? And trying to feel into how horrified each of these is by the other. Horrified. Not just disagreeing, but horrified. And how really part of the push of heresy that goes a little bit beyond it always pushes toward being a heretic as opposed to appearing as a heretic. And I think there's some internal dynamic there that is really, really important. I mean, the ideal Gödel point for me, I think it would be absolutely great to organize a high-level interfaith dialogue around how to occupy the Gödel point vis-a-vis one another, right? I think that would just be so brilliant. But my other great guide in all things is T.S. Eliot, who did his doctoral dissertation on F.H. Bradley, and he was also living and hanging out with all the realists. So he was back and forth between the coherence, quite explicitly, the coherence and the correlative position. And he's trying to figure out how to split the difference because his good friends are all anti-Bradley, anti-Hegel realists, right? Big pal of Bertrand Russell, But he's in the middle of graduate school at Harvard with Royce and James, right? And Santayana. And so he's just trying to figure out how do I do this? And he wrote a dissertation that was regarded by Harvard as the work of an expert. They instantly offered him a job in the philosophy department when they read it. But the best he could come up with, he has a lot of interesting things about triangulation and about the third term in any system. So that goes to the Holy Spirit thing. But the formulation I use all the time, like it's so elegant, is he says we have to move among these positions for the difference they can make to one another. Right? Which is, I think, that Nancy thing of we're doing this discourse to discourse, not discourses to some higher, all-enveloping external truth. So that's the best I can do with that. But I do think it's interesting to look at the mishandling of heresy. Both and also to go back to the little insight I was having, I don't even know why it's important to me right at the moment, but that people who are real heretics never define themselves as heretics. They have figured it out. You have a problem. So there's only heresy vis-a-vis from within one of those positions vis-a-vis the others. There's no heresy toward God. Only heresy vis-a-vis one of those others. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I'm just interested in how we dance that dance, and I'm extremely interested in something you only got to toward the end of your talk. Does that hinge on how we walk the fire of the big other?
All of that is magnificent. So there's a few things. First, you mentioned Simone Weil. I think a lot of people are, she talks about attention, obviously, famously, versus affliction. Affliction is enclosure. Attention is tied to disenclosure, opening. And, she goes into the factories and basically says the communist revolution is not going to occur because there's a spiritual affliction. There's an enclosure that has occurred that even if you, that basically makes the idea and thought of some sort of uprising impossible, and she moves toward thinking spiritual revolution, obviously. What's very interesting is to the point you were saying on attention, and then Illich talks about awareness, everyone's, Ian McGilchrist, et cetera, so forth. What's very important is the training of memory and attention are actually connected. Attention is not merely being present with what's in front of you. Like, if you can't be present with what's in front of you, you can't keep what has been in front of you present within you. And so what Simone really understood is that the loss of attention is also the loss of memory. It is not merely the loss of focus, that the loss of focus and the loss of memory go together. And if there's something about memory that is utterly necessary to staying in the girdle point, because you're always being moved out of it, by either correspondence or coherence, then the loss of attention is very spiritually consequential in that way. And the loss of attention will also make any ideas of being on the edge, all the stuff we're talking about, basically not possible. Also, you would lack the focus to determine in the first place, to determine the girdle point in the first place, and you would also probably lack the attention needed to determine appearing heretical versus being heretical, et cetera, so forth. You said some things that are also very important. The word heretical is indeed very odd, because it is a word that both means inside, outside. It means between, it means all of the spaces. One of the reasons I find the term fascinating is because it has a certain omnipresence to it. It is possible in systems and outside of systems. Well, this is very important then, because if we're looking for a way of thinking that can bring together enclosure and disclosure, closed and openness, then some sort of posture that can both communicate to the outside and the inside at the same time seems to be really, really important, right? Because it's almost like a phone link to the outside and the inside. Because most methodologies, either the phone, the line of communication is internal to internal, or it's to the external and it leaves the internal behind, right? And that is always what's very interesting, because if you say, well, you know, I simply don't believe anymore, then you're not in, say, the religion anymore, right? You've moved to the outside. Now, to the inside, you are a heretic, but you see, if you transition to atheism, here's the key. You're not really a heretic to yourself, right? Because you don't believe in the theism that would make you a heretic. So the key is that, you know, I am interested, to me, there's a heresy within and there's a heresy between. And you were pointing at the heresy between, which is very important that people understand that the differences between, and we, you know, we're obsessed with this in Belonging again. The differences between religions are very real. Like, you can't just say, no, they're just different holidays and clothings. No, 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 no. There are very, very deep different metaphysical claims and states that are at work, right? And if you don't tarry with that, then you will not actually, in my opinion, be able to address any of the tensions of global pluralism or the capital nation state of Koratani at all. And that actually, as just a quick note, that was where James Hunter, Dr. James Hunter, he's at the Advanced Cultural Institute. That was a big thing for him in books, in his sociological work, whether it be Before the Shooting Again, the Death of Character, all these different works. But he was basically like, multiculturalism, he critiques multiculturalism as treating difference as shallow. And he believed that this was setting us up basically for a return to, well, forms of totalitarianism and collapse and all sorts of things. Because if you really, 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 really do not get the differences deep, then you are going to be set up for a rude awakening, and the stakes can be very dire. So it's very important to be unsettled by the difference. That's really important. But for me, the key is you have to feel the heresy inside and outside at the same time. If you convert from a religion, then you don't feel the heresy within that religion. Like if you go to sort of atheism, or if you change from, say, Christianity to Islam, you're now a heretic to Christianity, but you're not a heretic within Islam, right? To me, the name of the game for this very massive problem that obviously I talk about all the time with Belonging Again is that the only way to maintain lines of communication, quote unquote, discourse, interreligious, however we want to word this, between different systems, is you have to be both a heretic within the system and between systems. That is the opening that's the puncture in the system that leads into that becomes a kind of opening to the other, right? Whereas if you just move out of, you in a way could be a liaison. You might be able to talk about both, but very often when people convert, say, from Christianity to atheism or atheism to Christianity, they're not able to maintain the line of communication. They're not able to maintain the openness. And in fact, one of the reasons, like when people convert, they almost very often they convert because they felt alone, right? Like they felt something was missing. So when they go into the new system, very rarely are they going to say, well, how do I appear a heretic here, right? They've already gone, they've already gone through a whole lot of existential tension, anxiety, all the stuff that, the sociologists talk about. So often when people go to a religion or leave a religion or change religions, they're actually looking for existential stability. But the problem is that, as I'm suggesting, is that's not going to lead to the address we need. That's just simply moving around the pieces of the problem. but it's not an address to the problem. So there has to be an appearing heretical within a system that is simultaneously then also heretical to what's outside a system. So you're basically feeling rejection all around. And when you're feeling lovely, right? So when you're feeling rejection all around, but here's the key, you're not actually a heretic. That is the kind of A-B bothness that allows a mode of subjectivity to actually dwell in and work with the girdle point. But that is the tension. Let me pause and just throw it at you on any questions. So I think what you're asking is extremely important.
Well, I want to add a wrinkle of difficulty. Let's see. I think it's really important. I think what's nice about the heresy language is that from the point of view of an orthodoxy as a system of enclosure, which I regard as profoundly necessary, right? At least to check in with, as I like to say. At least you can check in with the orthodoxy, and that's a kind of a ceaseless kind of nudge that I'm trying to provide in Philosophy Portal. Just check in. I mean, have a look at Aquinas. He wasn't an idiot. So anyway, but there's a perception of the heretic from without, from the Orthodox position. You perceive the heretic as just the embodiment of lack.
Mm-hmm.
There's something they didn't get.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's what makes it, I think, so attractive and important. And I completely agree. It has to be internal as well as external. In fact, you're explaining to me why so often this happens to be happening in my circle. People who convert, and we have to think about that word, to convert to Catholicism, convert to some ancient Catholicism, some scholastic Orthodox idiocy, and you want to say, hey, frying pan into fire, what are you doing? But I want to tie that, Daniel, to something I know that there's a huge literature. Interestingly enough, some of it is embodied in the literature on the nature of ritual in anthropology, about the role of belief versus the role of faith, right? The role of a creed, and with the reason the Abrahamic religions are such a outlier, an intense example, is because of the importance of creedal belief in each of them. So the minute that gets foregrounded, you have a happy home of forgetting subjectivity, forgetting the whole mix, and it just calls for that. It's really dangerous. And I like to point out to people that the saving grace for Christianity is its creedal statement is part of the liturgy. It's not part of a philosophical argument, and that's not true of the other two. So it is. I mean, the minute you say something like that, you can think of 1,000 examples why you're wrong, but you know what I mean? There's an elevation of that function of belief in Christianity that is very intense, simply because the teaching of Christianity about the divine is so utterly counterintuitive. And I think partly what you're getting at, and what is scary for people about the relativity, is that it is basically destabilizing in that way. It's really scary, because you can't hold on. There's nothing to hold on to. So I'm just interested in the creedal aspect of that, in the belief aspect of that. And we all know that faith is somehow beyond belief. It's different from belief. I love your emphasis on it taking courage. We know that it's a stance. It's not a creedal position. But boy, there is some elevation and itch to that problem in the monotheisms that isn't there, for instance, in Hinduism. It's very difficult for Hindus to get, what is your problem there? Why are you guys fighting? Surely truth is one, paths are many. End of story. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Riff on that.
I think it's an outstanding point. So, for me, like if I were to make an example, not that this is right or wrong, but I think it just kind of gets at the idea of what would be an example of appearing heretical versus being heretical. Maybe someone doesn't think it passes the smell test, but I think it's a good example of this sort of tension because, like you say, there's this tension between belief and faith. There's this idea that there's this sort of creedal things that you have to believe or else you're not participating in it, right? The whole idea of, say, coming up with the Apostles' Creed was, are we just going to make it anything goes? Anyone who claims Jesus? Well, what if he's, you could argue that in other potential, Gnostic texts, The problem was a new metaphysics was presented that countered the metaphysics that was being presented. So it wasn't that they just decided, we don't like this book. It was, well, what are the metaphysical claims of this versus that? Oh, these are different. This would not align with what exactly we take to be what Jesus is presenting, right? So it wasn't just a kind of taste thing. It was based on understanding the metaphysical claims that are going on. So those can't be arbitrary. And then to some degree, they are hopefully, or at least suggested by the creed or the orthodox, right? And then the question is, what is the absolute most bare minimum orthodox that you can have so that you leave lots of openness, but not so much openness that you then have chaos, right? That is able to hold something together, right? Yeah. And, well, we can settle on this creed right here. And then, of course, we have to debate what the terms mean. So it's not so simple, but at least there's a sort of notion there. But if one were to suggest, okay, well, what would it mean to appear heretical? Well, let's take an example that Peter Kreeft threw out. I always liked him. He's a nice gentleman. He made the point where he said, okay, so you have this idea that the only way to the Father is through the Son, and it is, only Jesus is how you be saved. And that's an idea that people put forth, where he says, okay, well, maybe it could be the case that because Jesus died on the cross, it's possible for everyone on the planet to be saved. But maybe it could be the case that just like people when they were worshiping the unknown stone, that Paul says, actually, this is this God, or you were worshiping a different God, the Ethiopian, you're actually worshiping God and not knowing it. You actually still could be saved even though you don't know you're worshiping God. And yet the only reason you're able to worship gods that you don't know or Jesus or different ideas or different traditions is because Jesus died on the cross. So what is he trying to do there? He's trying to thread together a holding to an orthodox position of saying Jesus is the only way that you're saved, but also noting that it is very possible that act of salvation is actually open to many people, because you can say, well, it's only by the name of Jesus. Well, at the time that would have been Yeshua, right? How many people call on the name of Yeshua, right? So, and they're in different traditions. So what is Peter Kreeft trying to do there? We may not buy any of that argument, but he's coming across to people who are hardline Orthodox as heretical. You're saying that you don't have to be a Christian to be saved, but he's also at the same time trying to point out that that very option could only be available because of Jesus, right? So he's trying to find both that are going on. So please, Cleo.
Yeah, this would be so helpful to clarify. There is a very famous half Hindu, half Spanish theologian in the Catholic Church named Raimondo Panikkar. Yeah. Big contribution to Vatican II. And he was developing this concept of the anonymous Christian. That was the central pillar of his work. And nobody was really buying it. And I think partly because it was expressed in the terms of an entirely different, culturally different way of thinking, which, nothing is more frustrating to a good old monotheistic white person than Hinduism, right? You're like, it's like there's nothing to argue with. It's like trying to play tennis without a net, Because they're like, sure, fine, great, no problem.
Right. Yep.
But I think the way you're articulating this is very clarifying for what it is to intend that conversation. I would just say that one of the things that Dante felt about Islam, our great guide, you and I really believe that nothing else is needed. Holy Scripture is all really very nice, but it's all there in the Divine Comedy.
That's funny.
It's funny. How many people realize how funny that is? I don't know. He said, never mind the practice, never mind the belief, never mind even the faith. The intent was schism, And that's where you're going beyond the being heretical to the promulgation, the advocacy, the insistence on being in a different metaphysic. And at the same time, you're running up against the Christian mandate to propagate the faith. So I mean, I'm just saying it's so freaking challenging, and I think this kind of almost mathematical understanding that you have, I so envy that. Both I think out of gender and probably out of the way my mind works. My sister has a very mathematical mind and a very musical mind, so I know what that is, right? And I don't have it. I'm a completely linguistic animal, but I see, they always say mathematics is the language of God. I see how useful those mathematical understandings are of this particular problem. It's very elegantly expressed there, and it makes me long to speak that language more. In fact, we could talk about that mathematization that I see in Lacan as well, where and of course in many others, where I'm attracted to it, and I also think it can be a kind of foreclosure against messiness. So that was a little bit of a wander, but
No, well, funny enough, I mean, honestly, for me, one of the perhaps basis of, say, Christian Muslim conversation could be geometry, because geometry is such a big deal in Islam, in fact, in that sort of form of art. And actually, can we discuss geometry? Can we discuss actually the forms and what is the base? How can we discuss metaphysics in those terms, actually? And that actually can be a way to approach it. I mean, a few things come to mind. I mean, also with the conversation, like practically speaking, because many Christians do not emphasize the Trinity. They practically are basically a big other. They do believe in a God the Father at the expense of the Son and the Holy Spirit. In that sense, they're very monotheistic in a way that is akin to Islam. There's actually more similarity practically for many people than they realize.
yeah, absolutely. She said, "Gee, that makes more sense to me than this Trinity thing."
Yep, yeah, that's exactly right. And so on that basis, if one were to say that there's actually something heretical about not making the Trinity the main emphasis in your thinking, that then there's already a certain humility to begin the conversation between different religions, that we're all actually just trying to work at something that we're trying to get better at understanding, that our very nature is to forget any progress that we make, that we always enclose that, and we're always very, very messy. And in fact, well, for me, part of it, when you start talking about, because I just view so much of what the social coordination mechanism doing is bringing people with different worldviews and different minds together, that actually helps them work out their own thinking that you actually can only do with and in communication with the other, right? Your tendency to slip into amnesia or forgetfulness is radically high if you are only dealing with people that basically share in your presuppositions, right? Because basically, I think it's basically because you feel like you don't have to remember it because your world does the remembering for you. Like what is outside of you just does it for you. So you don't need to remember all these different things or maintain these distinctions or no. But the problem is that means you're not going to probably stay in the girdle point. You're going to move outside of that dwelling. And then, of course, we get an enclosure and different things, right?
I want to say that I think there's a certain tendency to feel like orthodoxy is the enclosure and heresy is the disclosure.
Yes.
One of the functions of orthodoxy in my spiritual life, in a very direct way, orthodoxy is the thing that makes me open an enclosure. Like, for instance, if I get too hip, one of the best tips I ever got from my spiritual mentor was, she said, "Cleo, who do you when you spontaneously pray, who do you pray to?" And I said, "Jesus." And she said, "Try making it one of the other two members of the Trinity and see what happens." Right? And it just loosened the whole structure. So, and the incarnation can do that too, because they're so fragmented themselves. They're impossibilities. They're aporias in Derrida's sense. You cannot systematize those things. They don't go together. Nothing can be both fully human and fully divine. It's impossible. And so it won't let you stay still. And it's often the heretical position, especially when the intent is schism, that freezes. This is my little this is the defense of my life, essentially. I'm just saying, right? But there again, it's the subject. You have to know you have to be discerning about your own subjectivity, and you have to know exactly where you go when you default out of difference.
Yeah.
It's different for each one of us. And both heresy, I think, now that I'm talking, I think both heresy and orthodoxy can perform that closure. And both of them also can disenclose. So it's never a cookbook,
Absolutely. Well, that's for me why the trick is appearing heretical, not being heretical, because appearing heretical means you're actually orthodox. You just don't appear that way. And even if you, let's say maybe there's an error in Peter Kreeft's thinking. Let's say there is. Well, if you're appearing heretical, if that error is pointed out to you, go, "Oh, okay," and you would abandon that argument, right? You wouldn't stick to it. So this is the key: is you're always actually trying to be orthodox, but
Mhm.
doing it at the point where orthodoxy has to see what it appears as other to it, right? And
Yeah.
that is where the orthodoxy then becomes living, because it always it's like I was talking about in the present, a certain chain reaction sort of gets going, right? What appears heretical is that which is included in the orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy doesn't know it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be orthodox, right? So there's a blindness that has occurred that has actually led to the enclosure. But once you make something that appeared heretical turn out not to be heretical, you then make the system open again. You make it a
Yeah.
dis-enclosure, right? Whereas if you just say that the problem with being heretical is that actually is just a new enclosure, right? It's not actually an openness. Because it's more of the psychotic. It's like, sure, it's not the neurotic, it's the psychotic, I suppose, in Lacan, but that's actually also an enclosure. It's just an enclosure on your own symptom, if you will, right? As opposed to a big other. So there's a difference there. Cleo, please.
No, no, it's interesting that the converse is not true, and that's so significant. That is to say,
Yes,
we intuitively know that it's not okay to appear orthodox but be heretical.
exactly, exactly.
Surrounded by people who are that, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
that's not okay. And so it's really, so that means you're really onto a very fundamental principle there.
Well, and that's exactly why I didn't go with appear orthodox, because it doesn't work the other way. It has to
Exactly.
be appearing heretical, and it
Yeah.
and that is the mechanism of opening. Because when you appear heretical, they quote unquote target you, but then
Yeah.
you say, but no, this is actually part of what you believe, and that forces them to either update quote unquote their orthodoxy, or abandon their orthodoxy,
Yeah.
or find a mistake in your logic. Well, if this
Yeah.
is where thinking, this is where to me actually appearing heretical is almost I mean, it's basically for me the highest of all possible standards of thinking, because you
Yeah.
have to really, really, really know the orthodoxy to find the point that seems like it's not, that actually it is, and then it would require the courage to actually do that, right? And you can do this in any worldview. Cleo, please.
And that courage for you, that's courage in part because you know you're going to be up against the socialization factor
Yes.
there. Is there more courage needed?
Well, you're going to
Yeah,
appear a heretic, so anyone your faith will think you're abandoning it, family, friends, you will be
but like
seen as a
al-Halal, but
yeah. Yeah, and you could be wrong, of course. Like you
and you could
actually
be
might be a heretic. You thought you were
wrong.
appearing it, but you went too far, and now you have to humbly sort of come back, right? So that's really difficult, and you have to hold that in your subjectivity. And I also just wanted to note very quickly on what you're saying about choosing a different name. To me, when it comes to the dialectic and Hegel, for me, it's very important that the dialectic is not a method. He's describing how things actually are in themselves dialectical. They eventually pass over into otherness. And so on the edge of the girdle point, actually there, Hegel would almost suggest you don't need dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinking was actually to make you realize that things always pass over into otherness.
Okay.
And so now you need to transition into speculative reasoning, actually, right?
Mhm.
Because a dialectic just doesn't eventually go anywhere. It has to eventually have a speculative dimension. And you see, basically, like Hegel would say, the problem is if you just name God Jesus, you're denying the fact that God as God passes over into otherness. And so you're
Uh-huh.
solidifying him and thus making him what he is not. And he would actually apply that, like Korbosky, to everything. Everything is passing over. So if Korbosky, you call that a bookcase identification, you freeze it, you create an enclosure. And basically, here's the problem. Everything within us naturally encloses. Absolutely everything.
Mm.
Language, thought, relationships, all of us encloses. So a major emphasis on dialectic is warranted given that it is so
I
counterintuitive to our natural state. But then the weird move is you don't stay there. You get your medicine per se, then
yeah,
you learn it, but then you move into speculative reason. Then you move into that sort of movement. But the problem is actually you can this is where sociology for me is important. We're always developing new habits. So
mhm.
even if you're getting into dialectical thinking to get out of the habits of enclosure, the problem is you can develop a new habit of just dialectically thinking, of which you needed to get out of the enclosure, but then you end up in a new enclosure and you don't go anywhere. So then you have to break that habit, right? And so likewise, it's like Hume's return. So you start in an orthodoxy, which can develop habits of enclosure. You break to approach a certain heterodoxy or heretical thinking that then you actually don't let go so far that it becomes an enclosure, but you get in a habit of doing it that you could be careless. And then you have to break that habit to return to the orthodoxy to develop habits of appearing heretical, which are these very, very high stakes. But that's the work of dwelling in the girdle point. That's the work that's necessary for any kind of possibility of discourse across different metaphysical systems, religion, and so on. Cleo, please.
Yeah, I'm thinking a thousand things at the same time. So what if I'm taking all that on board, stipulate that. Okay. What if we think, what are the problems with seeing the relationship between enclosure and disenclosure as a kind of Derridian supplement? Because what happens there is very interesting. I mean, his point is a kind of simple. A lot of Derrida's points seem, in retrospect, a little bit like gotcha, you know, and that can get old. I fully understand why his star is waning. You know, it's the same lesson over and over and over again. You can get just as mechanical with your deconstruction. But I really like the concept of supplementation because my insight there was in the structure of the Catholic cult, the Virgin Mary is the supplement. Dante calls her the noonday torch of charity. You don't need a torch in the noonday, right? But she's the flaming heart of that thing. But what Derrida noticed is there's an inherent irony or aporia in the supplementation because it clearly points out that there must be a lack in the original book, or you wouldn't need a supplement, right? So it's pointing out that lack. And then at a certain point, it's like just the process you're talking about so eloquently, that supplement becomes the point and you lose the book. You know? So it's the dance, it's the rhythm, it's I think maybe a rhythm metaphor. I mean, one of the things mathematically that it occurs to me that it kind of operates like, I don't know if this makes any sense, and believe me, my math skills are, but it's like a fractal system. 1 minute it looks open, and the next minute it's totally closed. Mm-hmm. And this comes out of the thing that happened to me. My sister always laughs about this. We were at a children's museum, and they had a wonderful little running video clip, like a reel, explaining the concept of fractals, right? Little Cleo, who can barely add and divide, is like, wow. Oh, and she says, I'm not sure that I remember this, but she says I walked out and I actually uttered the sentence, which is now famous in our family. There must be something to mathematics. But it is like a fractal structure, and it's the subject position moving in and around and through it, except that my critique of that would be that the fractal structure is a little too much for me on the side of enclosure. I don't see anything that radically disrupts it to the point of heresy. So school me.
No, I think it's a wonderful point that you're making. So a few things. I love what you were saying on the supplement. I think this is very important because obviously Lacan talks about a certain excess that sort of unveils something retrospectively about the whole, et cetera, so forth, right? And so there's an odd way in which, and this would have to be elaborated on, there's a way in which if the human can dwell in the girdle point, they themselves become the supplement. That then brings with it in themselves the orthodox, that then leaves the orthodox behind because it's actually in the subject, right? Like if Jesus sits with the sinners, then the whole gospel is there, right? And so that is then the exit. Well, then the fire and the rose are one, and neither is consumed. I think also very importantly, I should note this. I really wish they actually taught mathematics, geometry first, then to algebra and addition, because I think a whole lot more people would love math if you actually started with geometry because you would see it. But because we have a certain reductionist bias, we build from additions and math up into geometry. I think it's a mistake. Basically, the way I teach music is you start with keys, 2 notes, and people grasp patterns in the piano way faster and love it. Then, okay, first we start with A, B, C. You start with the pattern, the shape. And then you move to the notes, and then you move to the rhythm. Likewise, mathematics that started with the shape and then brought to the algebra would be very, very important. Because the brain grasps geometry. That is what the brain naturally apprehends. We apprehend geometry. I recently ran into, discovered thanks to Self Dillinger, and I've bought her books, Jane Zwigley, who talks about the experience of meaning, who makes this point incredibly elegantly. I was very impressed by her lecture. It's called The Experience of Meaning. I would suggest it to everyone, and I bought her book. But it's this point we've talked about before with Leibniz, and that she's playing on is the idea that we apprehend geometries. We do not apprehend numbers. Numbers come after the apprehension. Calculation is after apprehension. We don't calculate up into a geometry. We apprehend a geometry, and then we calculate what it means. But this means an apprehensive activity is first. We don't build into meaning. We experience meaning and then dissect what it means, right? If that is how we had the experience of mathematics, then people, I think, would very much enjoy it, right? But you see, the key is the openness of mathematics is found in the geometric dimension, in the act of apprehension itself, because there's a grasp in it. And actually, there's a geometric relation between you and it in the apprehension that then keeps it in a certain dance between you in the apprehension. If you calculate and build up to math, well, then it seems like you're creating an enclosure. But if you actually start with an apprehension that then vanishes and you forget about, then the enclosure is hiding the initial thing outside the enclosure that made it possible, which is the act of apprehension that then you can forget. That's what basically happened. This is what Jane is talking about in Leibniz and all of my favorite counter-enlightenment thinkers, modern counter-enlightenment thinkers and different things, is that the entire activity of saying that is a triangle was possible because of an apprehension that is immediately forgotten once you say that is a triangle, right? So the apprehension is that of which not is included. This is the funny thing about mathematics when you get to geometry, and I'll give it to you for any thoughts on this, is that mathematics, precisely in being a quote-unquote perfect enclosure, makes naked its requirement on something outside the enclosure. It cannot hide it. But you have to look at it beyond just that. You have to include within it the apprehension act that made it meaningful, that made it what it was, right? But we tend not to do that because it happens so quickly. We forget about it, right? It's no different, like I'm upset in that paper on typography in Reconstructing A as A. We often, if I were to ask you what is the meaning of the word cat, you can go, oh, well, we can never cross that divide, signifier, signified, et cetera, so forth, right? And it seems like you can deconstruct the effort. And that's actually really important because there's been many enclosures that have been based on crossing the signifier, signified divide. Well, that seems like we're doomed then. Well, no, because if I take the letters TAC and then I say TCA and then I say CAT, oh, cat. Oh, so there was an apprehension that occurred that then opened the gap. But the gap came after the act of apprehension. And that apprehension is real. That apprehension is actual. And that apprehension is what makes the creation of the enclosure possible, but it is not included in the enclosure because it is automatically forgotten. But that is the apprehension made possible by the supplement of the human themselves that staying in the Gödel point reminds you of and habituates you to continue. The problem is when you get outside of the Gödel point, you forget at the root of all cognition is an apprehensive act because an external structure does it for you. You then outsource this to it, and you now have an enclosure in your habits. But if you stay in the Gödel point, you dwell to create habits where that apprehension has to be active for the human to be active. And a parenthetical is how you keep yourself from getting out of the habit of that active apprehension, and maintaining lines of communication outside also keeps it active, because keeping active that human element is everything to the question of if we're going to be extended by AI or replaced by AI, replaced by capital nation state, or extended it, or somehow maintain the human being. But seeing at the core of all intelligibility and active apprehension that geometry, quote unquote, can make naked, if you see that, and then saying in what mode of being and in what dwelling place can I habituate myself to always do that? Because if not, I will naturally forget I'm not doing that. I'll slip into amnesia and get out of the habits of doing it. It's in the Gödel point. And a parenthetical is the heuristic or hermeneutical practice by which you impose on yourself to keep you in that sort of dwelling place. But let me pause and give it back to you.
Great. And to be digested and practiced. So thank you. Curious because in the beginning was the word. So what happens there? Should the text have said in the beginning was the Trinity, in the beginning was the geometry? I'm just interested in beginning with the apprehension and the geometric form. First of all, there again, this is Islamic territory. Never has it been more meditated upon than there, right? Um, uh, could seem like I'm very wedded to the beginning that at the origin is difference,
Mm,
and that the order is subsequent from that, right? Which is what I think you're partly saying. But it could seem like that apprehension has an unduly unitary quality. So we have to keep a Lacanian split subject right there.
mm.
Do we not? And that's very hard to do because there's no, I mean, it's so funny that Lacan has that struggle between wanting a geometric expression of what he's doing, an algebraic expression, a calculus expression, and a verbal expression. Right? And I think it's dangerous to hold any one of them as originary. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So there's a few things. So first off, apprehension naturally forgets itself. This is the problem. Once you apprehend something, that's the whole memory problem. Is once I apprehend cat, I forget that I apprehended the word cat and I focus just on the definition and the thing in front of me, right?
Yeah.
So there's a natural self-forgetfulness. There's a natural forgetfulness in apprehension's primacy that then leads us to just looking at enclosure or breaking up enclosure, right? Not dwelling in a space in an enclosure that maintains an openness by keeping alive the act of apprehension and never letting apprehension forget itself, right? Which then, to get deeper into belonging, and this would have to be expanded on, I think actually to the degree you can engage in self-forgetfulness actually helps you remember apprehension. You gain self-forgetfulness is proportional to apprehensive remembrance is how it kind of goes. Because what tends to occur is we forget apprehension because we're focusing on ourself, the ego, our identity, these kind of positive projects, quote unquote, that actually are just enclosures. And so we lose apprehension. But when you have, say, community or the right kind of or the online spaces, these kind of conversations, there's a kind of you forget yourself in the conversation. You just find yourself saying things you've never thought before. Ideas emerge. Creativity gets a life of its own. That is, in fact, a certain apprehension having a life of its own, right? Because when you have a good conversation like this one, you don't think of every word you're going to say next before you say it. You almost feel the life of the conversation having a life of its own, right? There's a certain self-forgetful in the apprehension, then having this unfolding that is not reducible to any person involved. That's a kind of practice that has you engage in a self-forgetfulness that actually then brings to the forefront apprehensive remembrance, which gets tied to, as the dialogo circle, all of these different things. And this is the key. The word as a relational activity of bringing self-forgetfulness and rising up apprehensive remembrance is then not a stagnant activity. It is actually the basis of what allows communication so that one can forget oneself, right? There's also things too, because the problem is like the word in the beginning was the word. Well, if we think of word as a definition, then it has a certain stagnancy. But if we think of the word as the principle of the possibility of intelligibility, logos, then of course, if the word is Jesus, then the meaning of life is a person, as like Keller says. So it's actually like even the word itself has a humanness to it. Like the word is human. It is not a algebraic principle. The meaning of life is a person, right? Well, then it's a quality, not a quantity. And the word is the principle of intelligibility. Well, that means it is the possibility of geometry. It is the possibility of relationship. It is the conditions of possibility for geometry. So in the beginning were the conditions of possibility of geometry, of which is only itself in geometry, right? Yeah. Because a word that isn't, what is a word that is not exchanged? What even is that, right? It would be a point. And hardly that, because points don't actually exist, right? Points are simply mappings upon territories, right? So the word, for me, to say in the beginning was the word, and then I'll give it back to you for any thoughts, to talk about in the beginning was the word is actually to suggest that the ability, well, many people have said this, and David Theory Underground has made this point, is that speaking, writing, reading, certain practices of the word oddly seem to make you more human. They oddly seem to be tied to the increased capacity of the subject to even be itself, right? Well, this is weird unless there is something about language and the subject, as Lacan and everyone talks about, that are deeply tied together as the very horizon of intelligibility, of which is based on the act of apprehension, not the grasping of a definition. But the problem is every time, and this is kind of, I suppose, the irony of being a human, every time you apprehend, you necessarily create the possibility of a new enclosure, almost by definition. Because if I apprehend this is a pen, I now have created that of which I can turn into an enclosure, right? This is the problem. There is no possibility of human intelligibility without the temptation of undermining it as less than its full self. And
Yes.
then, since we experience the thing that we apprehend as stable per se, it just seems right. It seems correct to enclose upon it and to make it a definition. Why in the world would I make primary the active apprehension? Do you see the active apprehension? What is this apprehension you are talking about, right? It has this sort of, it comes and goes like the wind, yes? So then it's very natural to habituate ourselves into the mistake of thinking apprehension is not primary, but just secondary, or not even think about it at all. And that's the problem. In the beginning was the risk, I suppose. In the beginning was the gamble. And the problem is that I think this is where, for me too, and then I'll give it to you. This is why the emphasis on the living word is a really big deal. Like, it is a living word. That means it is an exchanged activity. It is a fundamentally communal activity. And then, of course, if Jesus is the word and Jesus somehow bridges the divide between man and God, well, that's a exchange. Now there's a relationality. There's a certain opening. There's a line of communication. And then the Spirit does that as well. But let me give it back to you, Cleo.
Well, when I was wrestling with this long ago, and I always do the etymology because that's my game, and Jerome translated word as sermo,
Mm,
which doesn't mean sermon in his context of Latin. It means discourse. It means
mm,
conversation.
mm.
So in the beginning was the conversation, which is just lovely, I think, really lovely. And there are very interesting correlatives of that in Islam too. But yes, I'm feeling it. I'm beginning to build it out, Daniel. It'll take some thinking, but I think it's intuitively how we walk. Um, I'm sort of deeply engaged with Terence Blake's work at the Philosophy Portal, and he has his own elaboration of the graph of the famous Lacanian graph of the subject, and he's trying to do what he calls mapping the noetic process itself, right? Which is, I think, really nice. And what I'm trying to do with his way, and he has a little bit of tinkering, by the way, slight sidebar, because Terence is very much a polymath and just in a way that I love, is he said in passing that he thought he could map that arc of subject formation against the chakra system.
Hmm.
So
Very nice.
talk about disenclosing a system. That would be a nice way to do it. But what I was doing with it is kind of tracking my own theological trajectory along that graph. And when you put that frame on it, you get a very interesting, almost a recapitulation, first of all, the history of of Christian theology, right? And also I think a very good typology of what the life of a seeker feels like. But adding that theological or religious dimension, it just ups the ante on everything. But I'm still not really comfortable, and help me with this. This is somewhat moving on from the things we now need to digest. I'm still worried. And again, there are many biographical roots of this. With this, what I feel is this desire to really foreclose, not relativize, but foreclose the name of the Father.
Mm.
And I had a brilliant, much adored, still adored, very crazy mother, and a kind, gentle, stabilizing father. Right. So there you go, and there you are. Just to make the subject position clear. So I'm always going to get edgy with this dropping the name of God, as I say. And Nasi, just a footnote, brings a lot of Blanchot into that, and has been a kind of gateway for me into more literary understanding of that. Literature for me occupies that space of managing to have the Father function recognized without having it be an automatic underwriting of enclosure. And how do you see that working? Daniel? How does that work for you?
Oh,
How's it
that's a very important
work
topic.
for you along that line?
It's huge.
So first off, there's a question to be had of could one actually manage to stay and dwell in the girdle point if they dropped the name of the father? If you did not believe the father had some sort of authority or power or was living, would you actually do it? Just because you heard this conversation and it sounded nice and you're like, I agree with all of the premises that would put forth here, I'm going to do it. Would you actually stay there or sustain it without some sort of notion of some sort of father that would actually have some sort of authority and backing to it, right? So there's a practical question there, right? Now, there's also the issue that you could believe in the Father, you could believe in God, and then go, okay, I need to do that. But if God is not, and we speak with this all the time with Thomas Jockin, if God doesn't strike you as beautiful, then you might be doing out of ethics and morality, and it's a certain kind of law thing, which would be problematic. And so you're actually enjoying the ethical. There's an enjoyment of being ethical, right? So you see yourself as better, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's that danger, but then there's an idea. I do think, and this would be a very large topic, I do think basically if there is something about thinking the Holy Spirit today that seems very necessary, which ultimately is opening up the discourse on the Trinity, thinking the Trinity, there is something about beauty that is primary today. And beauty is not merely an aesthetic symmetry, but it is a strike. It is a strike of beauty that is not merely up to your taste. It's that of which paralyzes you and makes you go, oh. And so that sort of strike, that sort of paralysis that has that sort of freezing that has consequence is very, very important. And the question becomes the following: if you foreclose, drop the name of the Father, do you increase or decrease the probability you experience the strike of beauty? If the answer is that you decrease it, this is very, very consequential, because then there is no possibility of something that could strike you as beyond yourself, as other, that says, like the famous local poem, you must change your life, right? But maybe there's an idea that many people, because the name of God has actually become a certain idolatry, as Peter Rowland says, it's actually a kind of idol to them, that actually dropping the name of God, for them in particular, might actually have them be struck by beauty, which actually could then be the possibility of the opening.
Allow that strike.
Yeah, that's correct, right? So there's this interesting issue where, for me, the question of the dropping of the name of the Father is, I don't want to relativize it. I want to make it conditional. And we talk about condition versus, there's objectivity, there's relativism. Michelle and I talk a lot about conditionalism, meaning there are certain conditions that have to be met for X to be the case. That doesn't mean X isn't the case. That means there are certain conditions. So, for example, a rainbow, as Owen Barfield talks about. Do rainbows exist? Yes, but under certain conditions, right? It's not just a matter of opinion. Based on the Japanese, in praise of shadow. What about shadows? Shadows require certain conditions. There has to be light here, object here. So there are conditions that have to be met. I think basically many of the most important things for humans to do are conditional. They are matters of conditions that have to be created, and it's very hard to make those conditions, and those conditions can also, once you get to certain rituals, be very dangerous because there are real forces that you're dealing with. But if you don't deal with conditions, then you end up just going back and forth. You're kind of trapped in a dialectic, per se, or back and forth between objective or subjective, when really it's conditionalism. So for me, like, there are certain conditions where dropping the name of the Father is actually dropping an idolatry that actually makes you open to the Trinity, that makes you open to the Father, right? But there are other conditions where actually taking up the name of the Father actually then opens you up to the Trinity, precisely because, I guess for me, like in the presentation, so every worldview has a way to appear heretical. So basically, Christian atheism can look heretical to atheists, right? And so likewise, taking up the name of the Father can actually look heretical to people who are within, say, an atheist worldview, when really you might be taking it up to see what happens, right? You don't necessarily believe, but you can take it up to see what happens, right? But this is also where that distinction between belief and faith, because like what Jesus shows, this is why to me it's a very big deal to put emphasis on the act of sitting with sinners, with the act of courage or different things, because anyone can do those things, regardless what your worldview is, right? And if these things actually then condition you and open new conditions of possibility, then one can actually do these things without necessarily wholesaling dropping everything they believe or changing what they think. And I think really basing that on the question, like Jesus, I think many American Christians especially hear the phrase like Jesus as I'll have the same beliefs as Jesus, right? I'll have the same dogmas as Jesus. But if you really look at what Jesus does, which obviously I'm emphasizing with appearing heretical, which is the key to fulfillment, well, anyone could do that. Anyone can do that in any worldview. You can appear heretical. And I can imagine to the question you're presenting that's extremely important. I can see what appears heretical for one person being dropping the name of the Father. For another person, it could be taking it up. But the critical point, though, I would say to both of that is whatever you do, it has to be for the sake of making you open to that which is radically other and potentially terrifying. I don't think taking up the name of the Father or dropping the name of the Father, if it is not a practice of opening you to this radical otherness, will be any good, right? Like there are many people who convert to a religion precisely to close off everything, right? But then there are also people that can leave a religion because they don't want to have to go to the same Sunday service and run into people that they have nothing in common with and learn to interact with them, right? So you're leaving so you don't have to deal with that otherness, right? The strike of beauty, which I do think the strike of the mystical ultimately, is at the heart of so much. But the problem is, of course, the mystical can destroy you. Right. I guess is what I want to say. It's to your present. Like I always talk about Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses. Right. You must always be dealing with a Lovecraft, which means you're risking being reduced to ash, but also the love that moves the sun and the stars. Right. So what is the practice that a given person needs to do in their worldview, which for me is always going to have basically something to do on a gradual scale of appearing heretical, that is going to make them open and take seriously the Lovecraft of life, the fact that there is a Lovecraft to reality with the craft in parentheses, right? That's what always has to be central. And the question of taking up the Father or dropping the Father, I think has to be situated with that opening to something that has a certain terror to it. But that terror is good, like good terror. I mean, the other, I guess I would also say this before giving it back to you, is that a lot of this enclosure, disclosure, openness within a structure, girdle point, in the girdle point, let's put it this way. In the girdle point, you get these very paradoxical realities, like a terrible goodness, a dreadful love, a piercing beauty, right? You get these things that seem to contradict one another, but they actually don't. They only do in algebra and geometry. They do not. You can, of course, encounter a terrifying love in a person, or a terrifying love in reality, or a terrifying beauty in a thunderstorm, right? A lot of things that seem to be contradictions actually on a higher dimensionality are not. You can have these descriptions and they actually be getting at a certain truth, right? In the girdle point, you're often dealing with realities that have this higher geometry, because the girdle point is precisely an opening of algebra to geometry. It's saying that you cannot in a single dimension get the full picture. Well, that means it can't be flat. And if it can't be flat, then you're talking dimensions. And you're now moving to geometry, because practically speaking, algebra is a geometry of one dimension, right? If you just, that's what it is, right? So you're practically algebraic if you don't have the girdle point. Well, that means it makes no sense to talk about terrifying loves or, piercing beauties or things like that. But in the girdle point, these things all make sense. So basically, the praxis of the girdle point are those of which make you able to handle those kind of encounters and open to those kind of encounters, which destroy all your categories, but it doesn't destroy your body. This is also the trick. You can, in fact, with your entire being, live in a life of those. You just can't think them. But isn't it wonderful that what you can't think isn't that of which must be? Like you can experience that beyond what you can comprehend. And basically, that's what you're putting yourself up to in the girdle point. And then, of course, also in appearing heretical, you are being a certain representation to others around you of that which they cannot comprehend, but actually is included in their worldview. They just haven't comprehended it yet. That's why it's an appearance of heresy versus the being of heresy. But let me give it back to you on any thoughts on anything.
Just running various literary points of reference, and I can't stop my mind doing that. Emily Dickinson saying, but internal difference where the meanings are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really, really brilliant. I think one thing I spend a lot of time thinking about a lot is the role of ritual as a practice.
Mm.
And I think most people kind of assume, especially in circles like the philosophy portal, where Catholics are few on the ground, and most people are either recovering from a terrible fundamentalist wound or emerging from a totally secular worldview. And there's a kind of innate modern anti-ritual line of thinking. And I think that's because ritual is always seen as enclosure, where in fact it's a repetition in the Deleuzian sense.
Mm-hmm.
It foregrounds difference,
Mm-hmm.
right? It stabilizes this so that you can see that. And so that brings me to the question of, and again, that I just love yours and Michelle's concept of conditionality as opposed to relativism. That is really, really useful. Cribbing it, taking it with me. Thank you. In my pocket.
Yes.
Um, I'm very curious as how do you see the role of these, first of all, an invented ritual is a contradiction in terms, because the essence of ritual is repetition.
Mm-hmm.
So we do invent rituals and we have to and we will, and we sort them out based on enough repetition to know what has legs. That's just the way rituals act. But for the most part, they're in that sense an inherently conservatizing force. But that can be a force of disclosure, the way history can, right? It can be precisely the opposite of what you might intuitively think. So I would love to hear, first of all, what you think is the conditionality for ritual, behind which is the question of the conditionality for church. And I'm very temperamentally and experientially uneasy. Something like Wake drives me crazy. It feels to me like Burning Man. Now, I think that's unfair. I'm in, right? I'm coming to see when I can. But there is something for me, about the structure of the Mass that for me, and I'm interested in the conditionality of that, it's always a disenclosure. And I'm thinking part of the apparatus for thinking that, again, is Nancy's concept, which is in Blanchot and a lot of other people, of the community of disavowal, he calls it. The community that is not visible, what Augustine would call the invisible church. By the way, Gilson has just a brilliant book about the invisible church. I think it would be so useful to think in his terms. Anyway, riff on church for me.
No, I think everything you're getting at is, again, very important. So,
First, on that idea of difference, repetition actually leads to difference, obviously, with Deleuze and different things. Like, there's also, too, before I forget, also it is very important sociologically, and again, belonging again, part one talks about this a lot, is the idea that basically many people like Peter Berger, Philip Reeve, Hunter, and all these people talk about the problem that you can only hold a social order together if you have a authority, kind of an underlying authority that can hold it together. Otherwise, you get a triumph of the therapeutic, which becomes a triumph of the individual that actually leads to a lot of freedom, a lot of individual freedom, but that very freedom, because people don't know what to do with it, and it all just seems random and any choice is as good as any other choice, leads to existential anxiety that overwhelms people, that then makes them susceptible to a strongman, right? But then, of course, if you have no individuation and you just have givens, well, then that can lead to the thoughtlessness of the hana banality of evil, because you just do what's given. What one does is simply the evil that you do, and it's not even evil, it's just what one does, right? So you just put these people on a train and you get rid of them, right? And that's the responsible citizen, right? So that's the danger of givenness, but givens have authority. You are to do them because it is what one does, right? So what you have now is the great tension of, okay, it doesn't work to simply get rid of givens, but if you just have givens, well, then you also have a enclosed sociological structure. And if you get rid of givens, you just have a bunch of atomized enclosures, right? More of the psychotic structure, the neurotic versus the psychotic, right? The problem that you have is you have to make a certain ultimate concern, I guess you could say in a Tillich sense, you have to make there be some sort of authoritative principle that will actually get people to change their lives. And more importantly, you could argue the most important activity that the underlying principle of a society makes people do is forgive one another. Forgiveness is the ultimate difficult activity, because if you think about it, forgiveness is irrational. Why would I ever forgive someone who did something terrible to me? It makes no sense. Well, because God died for you and you must. And if you don't have some sort of myth or story to compel people, there's basically never a good reason to forgive. And that's why the end of Belonging Again 2.1 is obsessed with the problem of forgiveness. And you're doomed. You're basically doomed. Because you also, if you don't have a process of forgiveness, you don't have a process of redemption. So you get all sorts of problems.
You have
So
negative repetition. You get revenge cycle, which is like a negative form of repetition. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I'm always big on, the Icelandic Volsung Indo, where it's like the logic of revenge is the logic of these stories. Like, a lot of people do not realize how severe the problem of revenge is for the formation of societies. And that, if one buys the premise that there has been a certain influence of Christian thought upon the entire world, not just Christianity, and that would be tied to the matter of forgiveness, the recognition that forgiveness matters. But here's the problem: the recognition that forgiveness matters without a metaphysical principle or a God to back it eventually gets eclipsed by justice, or an eclipse by, well, forgiveness is enablement, and it simply goes away. It fades away. And that's what we're seeing. So another problem you have in all of this is that if you don't have a father, then eventually the social order dissolves, especially if it's a diverse social order, because a diverse social order is where people have different values. It's inevitable those values conflict. Once they forget, people are hurt. They can't forgive one another. Pull apart. And then also, even if you're not directly hurt by someone, the knowledge that this could happen will simply make you less likely to go out or join the community or go and socialize with people. You get a unseen damage, which is the hesitancy of people to socialize, right? So you have to somehow get people to believe in something that has authority over them beyond them, or they just will not do what's uncomfortable. And then, alluding to a conversation that Tim Adlin had at Voicecraft with it was lovely, on AI. They were bringing the point that today you can basically, you're going to be able with AI to have relationship without friction, without tension. The AI girl bot will never judge you. She'll accept you for what you are. And we're really going to have a tension of, why bother to deal with human beings? Why would you go out and even deal with human beings if you can have all the benefits of relationships without any of the downside of the human being? And so AI becomes basically the finalization of this problem of having no mechanism to compel people out, and different things. And so for me too, ultimately this means there has to be a basis of society that is able to thread this needle, to thread this problem, of which not too open or too closed. And it is going to have something to do with something like ritual. And because the problem is, you could argue this, what happened gradually is the basis of society moved from ritual to dogma. And the dogma eclipsed the ritual, and the dogma became more real than the ritual. But the problem is, dogma invites debate, conversation, and once you did that, you get disagreement, you get fragmentation, and then the authority of the social order goes away unless you shut down debate about the dogma. Well, by definition, that means the choice is totalitarianism, censorship, or fragmentation where everything pulls apart, right? But if actually ritual is even more important than your beliefs per se, like the participation in the ritual is actually more primary than the dogma, well, now we're opening up a possibility of a new basis of a social order.
Absolutely. Paradoxically, it creates an opening.
Yes, that's exactly right. Because the ritual,
it creates an opening. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
I'm thinking of two things. First of all, I think the core of that ritual work, both in a negative and a positive way, is really sacrifice. Sacrifice is a development of a modality for managing this. And above all, it always points to a third term, because there's absolutely no rational reason on earth to kill something precious and beautiful if you don't have a third term. So why would you do it? You'll never do it. But at the same time, one of its major unintended or intentional consequences is to create an opposition between insiders and outsiders. So it's got all of this paradox loaded into it. But what I'm really thinking of, I mean, that just makes me want to go back to that part of my thinking, and maybe I will. But I'm thinking, I quite, when I was working on Eliot, he was very annoyed by, but very influenced by Josiah Royce, who I think is a very undersung American philosopher. It's a little bit the problem of there's a woolliness there, to which those of us who like to wield the sword are antithetical. You know what I mean?
Right.
But there's also, first of all, he really, really, really had a profound understanding of the difference between Christianity and Buddhism around the concept of forgiveness. And one of the things he pointed out is what sin really is doing a harm that no matter what you do, you as an individual cannot repair. And all of there's a notion that forgiveness somehow repairs the harm, and it obviously does not. It's not designed to do that, but people think it is. And there again, you have to have that triangulation. If it's just between two parties, one forgiving the other, it's immoral. No, it can't include justice. So yeah, good. Ponder this.
Well, I should note is that the most fundamental of all possible geometries, and we basically suggested that if it is not geometrical, it will be autocannibalistic. It will devour itself. It will lessen itself. It will become algebraic, and all the stuff we talk about a lot on the relation between becoming algebraic and basically eating yourself. The smallest and most fundamental of all possible geometries is a 3, because it's going to be a triangle. Like a triangle is the most fundamental geometry. And because also when you have a 3, they converge on a point. So you have 1, 3, right? And that also, the most fundamental geometry is going to be basically a 3 and 1, of course, has a Trinitarian sort of feel to it. The Trinity makes perfect sense as a geometry, does not make sense as an algebra. And that's part of the very refusal of the Trinity to be understood as an algebra has almost been a sort of grace on the human race to give us a chance to recover. Oh, wait, maybe geometry is more fundamental than algebra. Oh, okay. Like it's been a sort of like, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. The Trinity doesn't make sense for your sake. Because if it did make sense as an algebra, you'd be damned, basically. You'd be entirely enclosed. The game would be over. But in it only making sense as a geometry, well, then you start going, well, if God is a geometry, or the only way to know of God is geometrically, well, then maybe all things are only known geometrically. Well, in the image and likeness. So the most fundamental geometry is going to be a 3, because a 3 is a 1 at the point on the vertical axis. Because also as a 3, it can't, the trajectory has them meet. A square could go straight up, and you may never have the points meet on a vertical axis. But in a triangle, they go that way and so you get the sort of bringing together at a certain point, right? That would be included even if they go straight up. It would entail the potential and modality of the point where they converge, right? So you don't necessarily have to have a fragmentation. So it is not by chance that the ritual, it is the inclusion of the third that holds society together, because another way to put this is that a triangle that meets at the point as the most fundamental of geometries is also, well, the most stable of all possible geometries, right? That requires the least amount of energy to make, right? You just need 3 points and then it converges. So it is the most, it requires the least energy, and it is the most fundamental and the most stable, right? So if some sort of activity like that is precisely at the basis of your society, it is then secure, right? And that idea of the ritual or the key is, like you're saying, the sacrifice denies rationality. For me, a reason I always emphasize the counter-enlightenment, and I know many people critique Isaiah Berlin's counter-enlightenment, but I do think that the stream of thinkers that he's pointing at, out of the Scottish Enlightenment, back to Vico, and then it would go all, for me, it would include the modern counter-enlightenment, gets into Michel Planier, Benjamin Fontaine, and other people. There is a unique metaphysical claim in the background of the counter-enlightenment that is not, in my opinion, found in Enlightenment thinkers. So I do think it is a unique branch of thought, even though many people say, oh, it's not so clean-cut. People, a lot of thinkers overlap. Yes, there are overlaps, but there are things you emphasize and hold on to and things you bump into from the other side on accident, right? There are things that are central to your entire project and other things that are just kind of tertiary. And there are definitely different centralities of focus between the Scottish Enlightenment and the continental Enlightenment, for good and for bad. Because, of course, the Scottish Enlightenment can end up in fascism. This is the problem. This is the great tension. But the point is the following. If I'm looking at a Harman or different people, they basically, and Isaiah Berlin has this in one of his lectures, they say, if at the heart of society is not some truth that is in utter darkness and can never be grasped, then you're doomed. And the argument was that the Enlightenment basically had reason go into the depths, pull out all possible knowledge and say it's nothing. And that, of course, led, following, Horkheimer and Adorno and Livingston and all these people, it led to modern warfare, totalization. Because if there's not another way to look at this, and this is what Hume was warning about, if there is not something that is ultimately outside reach and yet is included in your thinking, well, then totalization is possible, right? Well, if totalization is possible, then total war is possible and total slavery is possible, right? But if there's always something outside, then there is a check on efforts of totalization, right? That's correct.
It's Bergson's friend Vital.
Yes.
There's friction.
Yes.
Or Eliot's saying, I love this saying, constantly worried about what's inside and what's outside. And he finally ends up saying in exasperation to his friends, if you find you have to think of it as outside, then it is outside. It's just a necessary geometric function. Yep. But I'm curious because my mind is now tired, so it's just doing association stuff. I'm kind of walking two paths here. I do a lot of work with indigenous people in this area, and we hold a lot of ceremony here. And my Easter went from a sunrise ceremony, fire ceremony in the Lakota tradition, to the Easter service. Right, 2 hours later, I was definitely giddy. I definitely needed a stabilization from that. But of course, the fundamental geometry of a shamanic practice is four. It's the four directions. Mm-hmm. Every single ceremony begins with orienting toward those four directions. And of course, at the center of those four directions is the cross. It's absolute contradiction. Mm-hmm. It's the impossible conjunction of the horizontal social matrix and the vertical, we'll call it transcendent matrix. And I'm very interested in that tension between the three and the four, partly just for gender reasons. The four for Jung is the feminine. But then I have to remember in the back of my head, my greatest mentor, my husband, who used to say, Cleo, Jung is it's just a kind of intellectual pornography. So using the geometry, though, as a kind of wayfinder, almost like a scout into this problem. I totally get that. And you're really making me want to start all over again. I actually was taught old school, so I was taught geometry before algebra.
Oh, wow.
And I hit a wall with algebra. I was just like, why would anyone ever do this? I loved geometry, right? But I could not make that translation. Now, I'm not justifying that little refusal of that hurdle, but I'm saying thank you for putting some legs under that for me and for making me see the deeper issue there, which is that quality of apprehension. I'm going to be very, very interested. I've just ordered Cynthia Bourgeault. You know who she is? She's a very influential Gurdjieffian Christian teacher. She's very interesting. She's Layman Pascal and Brent Alderman are very into her. Probably her magnum opus on the concept of the Trinity. And I just can't wait to read it. I think it's gonna get at a lot of this. And she's also sort of totally, she's a completely practice-oriented person. So it's going to be interesting to see how that sugars off.
No, magnificent. And I don't know where the time goes. I can keep you here all day. And I've got and you asked very important questions on church. Also, what you're saying on the 3 and 4, what often, a few things. First, very often when, in my opinion, great literary thinkers or people who are doing the arts, there's a certain gathering of many things you don't know, and then there's an apprehension. Many literary people are actually geometrical. They're looking for an apprehension. And the idea is you can only apprehend if you gather. You don't know how it all relates. You don't know how it's going together. It's like I was speaking with Sam Green about on her short story, The Mermaid. And there's something very feminine in that. Where, what Sam was saying is that the female can verbally process, which to the male doesn't make sense, but there's a getting it out all on the table, and then there's a possibility of an apprehension of the whole,
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Right. Oh, lovely. Yeah,
That
yeah.
just apprehends, right? And so geometry is very feminine, where the male doesn't want to get it on the table. They just want to get the relevant factors on the table, right? Well, that's all well. That can be efficiently very useful. But the problem is you better hope there's not something you're missing that you could have apprehended if you got it all on the table, that you might end up in a Kafka hallway you don't want to be in and you're stuck in it, right? So the masculine has the risk of, well, enclosure in an AA way. And making it very flat, right? Whereas the feminine way of thinking is a certain gathering for an apprehension, right? Which, even if the female, as Sam was saying, there's an idea of, yes, maybe this factor isn't relevant, maybe it isn't, but they're willing to almost take the risk of putting perhaps irrelevant factors or information on the table for the possibility of a higher order apprehension, right? Yeah. Well, that's a geometric behavior. And I actually think many people would love mathematics if it was presented as geometry is based on the epistemological activity of the apprehension, and algebra is based on calculation. And calculation is not bad, but and calculation can be very efficient and give you technology. But if technology becomes the problem that's going to replace humanity in the AI Cthulhu, as Mikey says, then we better start thinking apprehension. And also, critically, apprehension is the mode of thinking that gives you revelation that humanity cannot really realize their fullness with simply calculation. That there is actually some sort of way of knowing that if you lose, then you end up in people just calculating how to build their own worldview or their own way of doing things or their own ritual, and everyone atomizes, right? The key to apprehension too, and this is very important, apprehension doesn't feel like it's yours. Like the experience of apprehension always has a certain mystical quality to it. Like you didn't think it, you didn't know you were going to apprehend this. It just pops out of nowhere, right?
It's a lightning bolt.
That's correct. That experience is the experience without which a society becomes impossible. If there is no possibility of an experience of getting something that doesn't feel like yours, even though you somehow made this thing that's not yours possible in the conditions that you created by getting everything on the table, then there is no thing authoritatively other from human beings that can compel them to forgive one another or to participate in a way that isn't auto-cannibalistic. Because a really, for me, a key idea, we didn't realize that a role of religion was to make sure societies had non-rational activities that kept them from falling into Nash equilibria and game theory problems where doing what's rational gives you a suboptimal result, right? That was the secret to religions. They had a social function of making people do non-rational things, remembering the third, that if you don't do that, your society becomes autonomously rational and weirdly becomes auto-cannibalistic then, because the rationality has no substance. It gets into game theory problems. Kenneth error, preference, Nash equilibrium, that's what it is. So religions have had
coherence and no correlation.
Yeah. Exactly. That's what ends up happening. And so they got...
To return to our most authoritative source, I think you're just exfoliating. I'm so glad we're recording this. I want to think about this more. Exactly what happens in that moment of apprehension at the end of the Commedia.
Yes.
Where he sees both the geometry of the Trinity and the human face in a gestalt that almost is flipping back and forth, like, and the effect and the gateway to that. You're so right about this, Daniel. This is really helping me begin to reintegrate my literary side, which I laid aside for a long time. The key to that is beauty. The key to that is absolutely beauty. Yeah.
And the key to the beauty is you experience it as authoritative. Like
yes.
the experience of it is not, I get to decide.
People talk about beauty as taste who haven't been struck by it. That strike is clear. It's like, okay, if you cannot have that experience, then if you must choose between the authority of beauty or an authoritarian. That's what it's all going to come down to. And the key, but the problem is the authority of beauty requires apprehension. And if you have a society that doesn't teach apprehension, that has no resources of apprehension or places to go to learn apprehension, to even know it exists, then there is no option of the authority of beauty. So there is only the option of the authoritarian. And you, if you're in a self-enclosed system, are an authoritarian too, even if there's not an authoritarian dictator. You've created an authoritarian structure in the enclosure, right? So these are the stakes. And, I should note again, James Ziegler, who again, I'm very grateful to Seth Bringus. He talks about basically Gestalt theory in her book, The Experience of Meaning. Her elegance blew my mind. Just very beautiful, which makes sense seeing what she's talking about. But she just talks about basically Gestalt theory. And a way to look at it is basically the most fundamental reality is a Gestalt. Like it is a Gestalt is most real, which of course means geometry is most real. And what we long for are experiences of meaning, which are apprehensions of Gestalt. That's what we long for. She has this beautiful line where she's like, we basically, like what humans long for is an experience of Gestalt so powerful that they must change their lives. And I think that's exactly the truth. I think humans are looking for an experience of Gestalt, the whole, that they must change their life afterwards. That's what people long for. And that is the kind of experience. So then this is the thesis, and then I'll bring it to ritual. And I don't know where the time goes. And any thoughts on anything, but I know it's late, and I guess I should get the kids or something. I think they're on their bicycles in the woods at this point, but that's fine. That's what kids are supposed to be. So, is that for me, the maintaining the possibility of the Gestalt, the strike of beauty, to put it for Stahl, is contingent upon being in the girdle point at this moment in history, at least.
All right.
We have to be in the girdle point to have the experience of the strike of beauty and the revelation of Gestalt. And basically the question is, what are the rituals what is a ritual? Let me put it this: a ritual has to be placed in the girdle point, okay? That people gather.
That's the condition.
It gathers people, right? And that's what the Mass did. It was in the girdle point because it basically denies the coherence correspondence. Like there's a break here, right? Then you have to come here. And of course, what happens at the Mass is you go 500 times and one day you've gathered enough that then the apprehension can occur, like gathering all the info on the table. The key is repetition, as Deleuze talks about, is a gathering mechanism. When you are repeating, you are gathering. But the trick that Deleuze is pointing is to, and I think that religion's understood, is you actually can increase the probability of apprehension by regathering the same thing. Not by gathering different things, but when you regather the same thing, it actually then bursts up into a higher geometry in the excess is what occurs, right?
Yeah.
And so when you so the probability of an apprehensive experience, which simultaneously discloses that the only intellectual act isn't calculation, that there's something more, that then also is experienced as an authority that you must change your life, is how you start arriving at the, dare I say, middle between orthodox and heretic. You actually are arriving at a way to have an authority. You have a Father that is not reducible to a name of the Father, but is not a denial of the Father, because there is that bursting of, like Dante of saying, of the human effigy in the face, right? And so then basically what has to happen, and I think basically for me, Peter Rollins and Wake, a lot of those two are speaking to, Peter Rollins for me, when I was younger, coming out of more fundamental evangelical backgrounds, had a very positive impact because, there's ideas you never had. And a lot of those people too have never done ritual. They have no experience of ritual. And so the idea of creating for that audience new communal activities and ways to come to terms with lack can be a good experience. Ultimately, it has to lead to a strike of beauty. Ultimately, it has to lead to ways to have a strike of beauty and figuring out how to do that. And I think that's a lot of the question.
The possibility of that.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's a matter of grace. You can't contrive that, but you can optimize the conditions for that.
That's it. And so for me, basically on the question of church, ritual, and building society, the question is, what are we building it for, of course? And you can say to provide resources or blah, blah, blah. Well, basically what we are suggesting is that what is necessary is some sort of social, ritual, institution, et cetera, so forth, of which is located in the girdle point, that gathers people regularly so that they can gather experiences that increases the probability of an apprehension of the strike of beauty, which then discloses them to a certain authority that is transcendent of their immediacy, but found in their immediacy. So it's in and out at the same time, which then makes it clear that such an ontology and metaphysic is possible. And once people know that's possible, it can become the basis of a social order that doesn't fall either into the totalitarianism of Gibbons or the reactionary totalitarianism of the loss of Gibbons. And figuring out how to facilitate that I think is extremely important in terms of building institutions. But then the individual practice of actually feeling that macro design is all macro structure, for me, is found in the appearing of the heretical. And how one does that, how one thinks that, and how one puts themselves in places to feel that becomes all part of the picture of what it means to actually put these things into practice so that the love that moves the sun and other stars can be spread amongst all of us.
Beautiful and beautiful pulling that together, Daniel. That was really neat. It was
Yes,
elegant, elegant.
yes,
That's really wonderful. One of my great teachers and a text I follow very closely is the great Martin Prechtel, who is a German-American student of Guatemalan shamanism. He's a very highly initiated Guatemalan shaman. But one of the things he talks about all the time in his books as part of what the indigenous ceremonial culture can bring to the table is the absolute emphasis on beauty. You know, the amount of time and energy and sacrifice that goes into making every single ritual a paradise of smells and tastes and flowers and light, and it's just and it's essential to the discourse of sacrifice too. You sacrifice, you don't sacrifice a natural bull. You decorate the bull, you make the horns gold, you garland it, right? Just so lovely, Daniel, and thank you for bringing that train into the station with such elegance. So good.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much, Cleo. And yeah, and for me, the beauty is at the heart of it. And also, too, there's a sacrifice in appearing heretical. You're sacrificing how you're seen by other people. You're sacrificing your emotional stability, your existential stability. You question yourself. There's a sacrifice in beauty because once you get struck with beauty, well, you got to change your life. So there's a certain sacrifice in that occurs, which points to the excess, and that's where the human in the girdle point is the supplement. But the supplement is confirmed in the strike of beauty, right? It is confirmed as supplement when you have that strike, right? And so because also too, like for me, when you mentioned Mary and Mary functions as a supplement also in light of the beatific vase with the human effigy in the face, right? There's a certain retrospective that occurs there that then points back because it is pointed to this point, right? That creates this certain structure. And so I think all of that is extremely important. And I always enjoy speaking with you, Cleo. Thank you so much for your time.
Likewise. Thank you so much. So mote it be, Daniel.
Yes, ma'am. All the best.